We're going to talk some Detroit Pistons and Detroit Red Wings now with an MLive Media Group beat writer Ansar Khan on the Oakland County Megacast. Mr. Khan, thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
So how are you? How is your team at MLive, your family?
Good. Thanks. Hanging in there. Seems to be hopefully getting better, and hopefully we'll all be over this soon.
Yeah, hopefully. Have you been in the office, or have you been working through this entirely at home?
No, we're all working remotely, working at home. So, uh, even under ordinary circumstances, we're being that the jobs that we do, our offices are kind of pretty much the teams, stadiums, and arenas that we cover. So we're rarely in the office anyway.
Have you noticed during this that have you noticed or have you experienced any issue kind of digging in, finding those new stories without the sports games going on to create that narrative as this crisis has continued on, or have you been focusing a little less maybe on the games themselves and on these individual sports and more on the players? How have stories been coming in the sports world during this without a lot of these games going on altogether?
Yeah, no, it's much different. Much more difficult when you don't have events to analyze, to write about, to comment. No games since March 10th. Uh, so basically, what it's come down to is a lot of analysis, look ahead to what's next, uh, projecting moves that they might make. Analyzing potential free agents, draft picks, that sort of thing, kind of a look ahead, and also a bit of a review of the season. So definitely, it's been different uh, content, trying to come up with new content.
Yeah, projecting the future is definitely the big ticket item of the sports talk world in this current at this current juncture with sports being out and speculating when are our sports going to come back? When's the NBA going to be back? We talked with Dan Dickerson. When's baseball maybe going to come back, and how's that going to look? But also looking into the future because some of these seasons may end. Some of our local teams, especially, their seasons may end. They may not qualify for these playoffs, or they might. We'll have to see. Some of these plans for these sports organizations have not been set in stone yet. And you talk about looking into the future. The Pistons this week began their search for a general manager. There's been a lot of names speculated out there so far. One of those names is, of course, Pistons legend Chauncey Billups. Have you heard of any names, any other rumblings of people that the Pistons maybe are looking at so far? Anything serious in their search thus far?
Well, I don't know about serious in their search, but certainly you hear several names, names that you would expect. Certainly Chauncey Billups at the top of that list. A couple of years ago, after they fired Stan Van Gundy and were in search of a GM before they hired Ed Stefanski without the title, a lot of speculation that Chauncey was in the running, that he could be the guy. Uh, and once again, now here, Chauncey 2 years later is probably at the top of the list, certainly among Pistons fans of who they'd like to see in that job. Another former Piston, Tayshaun Prince, is a possibility. He works for the Memphis Grizzlies. Um, Shane Battier, a local guy from Detroit Country Day, who works for in the analytics department for the Miami Heat. He's certainly a possibility. He also was a candidate 2 years ago. I'm not sure if he interviewed or not, but he withdrew his name from consideration at one point and stayed with the Heat. Those are certainly three names near the top or at the top of the list for the job, which is essentially to work with or under Ed Stefanski and kind of learn the ropes while Stefanski's still here, because especially in Billups' case, he doesn't have any front office experience. He's an analyst for ESPN, so that would seem to be the kind of the ideal situation for him to come in and learn all about running a basketball team under Ed Stefanski.
And we've seen that system work before. We struck gold with it in the most recent situation where that happened in Detroit sports way back when Joe Dumars had retired from basketball, and he joined the front office and kind of learned under the wing of guys like Rick Sund how to do the job. Came in and of course built the going to work Pistons team that was very successful for a long period of time. So a guy like Chauncey Billups coming in and learning the ropes from someone like Ed Stefanski could in theory work. It's worked before, and maybe they strike gold again. But my question at this moment for you, Ansar Khan from MLive Media Group, is it's been 2 years. Ed Stefanski comes in after Stan Van Gundy is fired and after Jeff Bauer is let go as the general manager. Why now? Why wait 2 years down the road? Why at this point is it finally the time where Tom Gores and Ed Stefanski and Arn Tellem are saying, okay, now it's time to bring someone in to run the basketball operations?
It's a good question. We really don't know what the logic or the reason for the timing, other than possibly, Ed Stefanski's 66. He's been in it for a long time. Perhaps he's looking as a transition toward retirement. That's a possibility. I think maybe when he came in 2 years ago, maybe that was the plan, that just to have him on for a few years, start the rebuild, and then kind of hand over the reins to a younger up-and-coming executive. And basically all we can do is speculate. My guess is that would be the reason. I think probably right from the start when he was hired by Tom Gores that was the plan, and that Stefanski would be kind of a stopgap, a transition into the next era.
And with that being the case, we saw after the Pistons were swept by the Bucks in the playoffs that the front office, particularly in the ownership, the owner Tom Gores had said that this isn't a rebuilding effort. We want to contend right now. They have a season that isn't very successful following that up, and now they're looking for a GM to bring in and learn under Ed Stefanski, or potentially take the basketball operations role away from Ed Stefanski. Do you see that as being a point of transition to acceptance that this Pistons team needs to go through a rebuild, or are they still trying to contend right now with the core with Blake Griffin, Derrick Rose, Luke Kennard, and the young guys like Christian Wood and Sekou Doumbouya?
No, they're definitely they're absolutely 100% in a rebuild. Last season, 1 year ago at this time, they weren't. The plan was to try to get in the playoffs. Their goal was to get into the top four in the Eastern Conference. They made a series of moves that they felt would bolster their depth and have them in contention, if not at least for a playoff spot, at least in the upper half or in the middle of the pack of the playoff teams in the Eastern Conference. And then Blake Griffin gets injured, Reggie Jackson gets injured, and it became clear that they're not going anywhere. And so, mid-season they had to reverse course, go into rebuild. They got rid of Andre Drummond. They bought out Reggie Jackson. They bought out Markieff Morris. And so, without a doubt, they're in 100% in rebuild mode now. And I'm sure many would argue that they should have done this earlier, like a year or two earlier. But, when Gores made the big splash of getting Blake Griffin, they were pretty much all in. I mean, you don't get a guy like Blake Griffin and then go into a rebuild. You have to try to win now. But when it became obvious that they just weren't going to be able to get there with the team that they had, they started blowing it up. And now they are in a rebuild, and it's going to take some time.
And with that being the case, guys like Derrick Rose, who's had a really nice season for the Pistons, has for the most part been able to stay healthy and be very productive running the backcourt, particularly in the second unit for this team. with the rebuild being in full swing and the season maybe being in flux, the Pistons may continue on in play, but likely in the scenarios that we have so far, discussing a potential playoff, the Pistons may not be involved in that. And with the rebuild now in full swing, Derrick Rose has a year left on his contract. He's coming off, he's had a really nice year here in Detroit. Contending teams are looking for a point guard that can lead them to the next level. But the Pistons are also looking for someone to bolster their backcourt going forward, and they may bring in young guys from the draft that would be running their backcourt and could learn a lot from a guy like Derrick Rose. Do you see the Pistons making an effort to move him, and do you think that they have a good chance of being able to do that and getting a decent return?
Yeah, they can definitely move him, and they could have moved him this past season at the trade deadline. But Rose, he likes it here. He wanted to stay. And my guess is that they honored that they could have traded him and would have ordinarily, but they honored his wish to want to remain with the team. He's close to Arn Tellem, his former agent, and my guess is basically that they honored his wishes to stay with the team. But I can see a scenario where they might use their first round pick on a point guard. That's certainly their biggest need, and where they could draft somebody, bring him in, have him kind of learn under Rose for the first half of the season, and then certainly at the trade deadline, there's really no reason for them to hang on to Rose. They could trade him for a draft pick, and he could help a playoff contending team. So I would be surprised if they didn't trade him by the deadline this year or next season.
Keeping in mind, we mentioned the rebuild being in place, and we mentioned that a lot of that's going to be impacted by the season going forward, whether or not they're going to continue on to play and potentially be contending for any sort of a victory in a playoff scenario. The NBA season has not quite been set for how it's going to continue. We've heard some rumblings of different potential playoff formats, a 1 through 16 seed format. I've also read about potential for a round robin World Cup like format playoff if the season is to continue. Which do you think is more likely, given where we stand with COVID-19 and with the way that the NBA works, keeping in mind that COVID-19 is still very much a factor in all of this?
Excuse me for a minute. It's raining real hard here. I got to close the window.
Oh, that's okay. We'll just take a brief pause then. We've been speaking with Ansar Khan, the Detroit Pistons and Red Wings beat writer for MLive Media Group on the Oakland County Megacast on our family of TV and radio stations, Civic Center TV and Birmingham Area Municipal Access Television on the radio, 89.3 Lakes FM and lakesfm.com, 88.1 WBFH, The Biff, and WAHS 89.5 Avondale Community Radio, talking about the Pistons, their rebuild, and the NBA season, which is not officially scheduled to resume just yet. There are rumblings of different potential scenarios that are out there, and so Ansar Khan from MLive Media Group, some of those formats that have been discussed are a 1 through 16 playoff kind of format, where the one seed, the team with the best record in the league would play the team with the 16th best record in the league, and so on and so forth. Another one that's come up is a World Cup style round robin kind of format with a group stage and then a playoff stage on top of that. Which do you think is more likely, given where we stand with COVID-19 and given where the NBA is kind of leaning with how to continue their season?
I think if all teams are in one hub, Orlando, all 16 playoff teams, I could see them going to a 1 versus 16 where conferences don't matter. East can play West. Obviously, there's no travel, so that doesn't matter. I could see that happening. If they're in two hubs, like say Orlando and Vegas, then you would have you'd obviously have to break it up into East and West and do it a 1 through 8 that way. But either way, I think we'll see my guess is it'll be a traditional playoff series, best of I don't know, best of 5 first round, or if they do best of 7, if they decide that they have enough time to get 4 rounds or however many rounds of 7-game series in, that they'll do it that way as opposed to a round robin format.
One issue that's currently contributing to keeping the NBA from restarting its season is the need for a second kind of training camp, even if it's a brief one, just to get guys back up to speed and back into the physicality of the game. And an issue that is within that issue is practice facilities. Some states are allowing sports facilities to reopen and these teams to return to their facilities. Michigan's not one of those. Certain teams have been able to return to their practice facilities and begin to work out and begin to work on basketball once again. The Pistons, not one of those teams that's, of course, able to do that. Will teams be able to begin to move players and operations, do you think, to places that do permit these activities in the near future, especially if a season continuity format is put in place relatively soon?
Are you talking about Pistons specifically?
Pistons specifically, but other teams too that are in areas that maybe aren't allowing gyms to reopen and sports facilities to reopen, because these players need to retrain.
Right, and the other thing that they have to be conscious of is that everybody's on equal footing. You obviously can't have half the teams are able to start training while the other half are in states or cities that haven't opened up yet, so to speak. There has to be some equity there, and with also they have to obviously watch the calendar, and they can't delay this too much longer if they want to get a complete 2021 season in. So yeah, I could see that allowing players in states that are still in a lockdown to travel elsewhere, those teams and have their training camps essentially in those locations for sure. They obviously have to. If they're running up against time, and if Michigan, for instance, or probably not Michigan, since the Pistons aren't. If they go right to the playoffs, obviously the Pistons wouldn't be in it. But whatever team, they have to get them to areas where they can have a training camp and get this thing started.
So we've been talking a lot about the NBA and what potential for a continuity of their season may be coming soon, but there's nothing in place. The NHL, on the other hand, does have a plan. They're coming back with a different playoff format, 24 teams. The NHL Players Association has approved that plan. How can you explain a little from your knowledge? How's that going to work? Will all cities be involved, or are there other locations or a few locations specifically that are in place for this return?
No, 24 teams. 7 teams are out of it. Obviously, the Red Wings, being last overall in the NHL, are done for this season officially. The 24 teams, the plan is to have 2 hub cities that haven't been determined yet. Most likely one in the East, one in the West, and have 12 teams, 12 Eastern Conference playoff teams in one, the 12 Western teams in one. And what they're going to do is the top 4 teams in each conference, by virtue of points percentage, get buys in the first round, and the next 8 teams playing in a play-in tournament, a play-in round, best of 5. And so it'll be 5 versus 12, 6 versus 11, and so on. But while those teams are playing in the best of 5 series, those other 4 teams that get buys into the next round will play a round robin tournament. So 3 games, those 4 teams will play 3 games each against each other. And that'll determine their seedings 1 through 4, and it allows them to stay sharp so that they're not rusty while those other teams are playing.
One issue that is both in the NHL and the NBA that may be oncoming is how do you conduct the draft lottery, giving a continuation of a season where some teams are going to be out and some teams are going to continue on, and in a format where more teams are in the playoffs in the NHL scenario, and an equal number of teams are in the playoffs in the NBA scenario, but performances are different. More basketball was played, more hockey was played. How do you imagine that these draft lotteries may be altered, or will they not be altered at all?
Well, the NHL's already, earlier this week, they announced their plan, and the draft lottery is altered. And it's a bit complicated. What it boils down to is the Red Wings, with the worst record in the league, still nothing changes for them. They still have an 18.5% chance of winning the lottery, which will take place the first phase of the lottery. First of potentially two phases will take place on June 26th. And what they're going to do is, same as always, the 15 teams are in the lottery. The 7 that are currently done for the season, plus 8 more that will, the 8 losers of the play-in round of the playoffs, which obviously won't be determined by then. They won't know which teams are going to advance, so they'll use placeholders. Teams, they'll designate teams A through H. And what they're going to do on June 26th is, as usual, they'll hold 3 draws to determine the top 3 picks. Now, if those top 3 picks, the 3 teams that win those draws are among the 7 whose seasons are over, then that's it. Then there's no need to have a second phase of the lottery. But if a team that qualified for the playoffs wins one of those draws, then they'll have to have a second phase of the lottery at a point that still hasn't been determined. It'll be obviously after the play-in round. But as far as from the Red Wings' point of view, nothing changes for them. Still 18.5% chance of winning, but also a 50.6% chance of dropping to 4th, which is the lowest that they can go. Ottawa, the second worst team in the league, by virtue of having San Jose's first round pick. San Jose was the 3rd worst team in the league. Ottawa actually has the best chance of winning the lottery at 25%. And as far as the NBA, I don't believe they've announced anything.
Yeah, they haven't announced anything so far. Ansar Khan joining us from MLive. He is the Detroit Pistons and Red Wings beat writer for them. We thank you for being with us today. We have to move along. We only have a couple more minutes left in the show, but thank you very much for joining us on the MegaCast. We enjoyed having you.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.